up, swashbucklers? You're listening to Under the Crossbones, episode number 203. My name is Phil Johnson. I'm your host for the show and the ship's consigliere every week. And thanks for tuning in and telling your friends and visiting sponsors, sending donations, all that cool stuff that you do that helps me keep the old boat afloat. I appreciate it. We're sponsored today by Scuba Wise and Pirate Radio of the Treasure Coast. We'll talk about those guys later on. But here we are in episode 203. Fun fact about the number 203. In the year 203, a man named Ling Cao died. He was a military officer serving under the warlords Sun Si and Sun Quan during the late Eastern Han Dynasty of China. He was killed by a stray arrow in the midst of battle. Now, it was friendly fire, apparently, from what I read. And who was that arrow fired by? That arrow was fired by a man named Gan Ning, who was originally a notorious pirate, but gave up the lifestyle and eventually became a military officer under the warlord Sun Quan. Look, we got a pirate reference in there for that one. And there's so many pirate stories in the Asian cultures that have not even been touched on this show yet. And I hope Nick is going to do some of those. They're harder to find information about for some reason. I don't know why that is, but I think we should all hear more about those because there's some interesting stories out there. Anyway, so here we are. If you're enjoying the show, come join us over on Facebook, facebook.com/underthecrossbones. On Twitter, we're at undercrossbones, and of course, make sure you're subscribed by hitting that subscribe button in whatever podcasting app you are listening to right now. And the subscribe is it's free. It just means you get the new show automatically downloaded to your device every Tuesday when it comes out. So my guest on the show today, you're going to dig this one. My guest is Rich Cohen. He's the author of a book called The Last Pirate of New York. Now, that's an intriguing title right off the top, right? The Last Pirate of New York. We're going to talk about the critical connection between old school pirates and new school organized crime gangsters in New York. This is the guy who is the connection between those points. And the book itself is fascinating. It is so over the top and crazy, like you will not even believe this is a real story, and it is a real story. So Rich is going to tell us about that. We're also going to get into some of the running themes that are a theme over all of his books, and we're going to talk about the Rolling Stones, chess records, Pirates of the Caribbean, sugar substitutes, and a whole bunch more. There's a lot of stuff in this talk because he's written a whole bunch of really interesting books. So we're going to get into that in a second. You're really going to dig this one. It's a fascinating talk, and I think you're going to really enjoy it. We will be giving away 2 copies of The Last Pirate of New York. I have 2 copies. They're sitting right here on my desk, and we're going to give them away. And if you would like to win a copy of this book, we're going to make it super easy. Send me an email to phil@underthecrossbones.com. That's Phil, Phil, at underthecrossbones.com, and use the subject line, I want a book. Easy enough, right? I was going to make it something weird and convoluted, but let's not do that. Let's make it simple. The subject line needs to be, I want a book. And then in there, put something in the body that says you want to win the book, all right? So that I know who it's from, put your name and email address and all that kind of stuff in there, okay? So email phil@underthecrossbones.com with the subject line, I want a book. In the body of the email, stick your name and email address in there so I know what you're looking for, and we'll do it up, all right? And we will give away those books at the end of August, last day of August. What is that, August 30th, I guess? August 31st. Will be the last day to enter, and then I'll send out an email or something announcing the winner. And of course, Nick will have taken over the show by then, so Nick will probably announce it on the show as well. It's a weird spot to do a contest, but why not? We'll do it up. I spent most of last week on stage somewhere. I'm in the last throes of editing my show to be filmed. We're filming this Friday in San Diego at the Comedy Palace. I'm very excited. We're going to do a 4-camera shoot, all 4K video. Tickets are selling good. It's going to be amazing. If you happen to be in San Diego or near there or know people there or whatever, it's the Comedy Palace this Friday, August the 16th. Comedy Palace in San Diego. 2 shows, 7:30 and 9:30, and we're going to film everything. It's going to be fantastic. I'm very, very excited. And if you do want to go, tickets, use the discount code PHIL50, PHIL50, PHIL50 to get half off your tickets to get into those shows. So that's coming up. So I spent the last few nights on stage just doing short sets, long sets, kicking it out, trying a couple new lines here and there, just doing the last minute editing. And it was so striking to see the different kinds of venues that I was playing in. So I think it was Thursday night. Yeah, Thursday night, I was playing in a brewery in San Jose. We have lots of breweries around now. A lot of places are starting to have breweries, and it was in the back room on a tiny, tiny stage where I was just slightly elevated above the audience, and the place held, 20, 23 people, something like that, and it was sold out. If you can call 23 people sold out. And it was good, and it was interesting, and they had a tough time with some of the material, which was further proof of why I'm not filming this one in San Jose, but that's okay. And it was good. So tiny gig, tiny stage, tiny audience. The next night, I was playing a winery in Carmel. There's a theme here, alcohol, right? I was playing a winery in Carmel. This one, huge show. There were like 250 people. We did it in the Barrel Room. They brought in a crew to do sound and lighting. Nice big stage, full sound system, full stage lighting. They had it catered, not for the audience, just for the comics and the producer who was there. They catered it for the 5 of us. And it was in the Vineyard House, beautiful Vineyard House in Carmel, right? Rolling hills, Spanish colonial architecture, the whole thing. We had just fantastic, wonderful catering. And I had to leave that night. I wasn't able to stay, but they were putting us up in the Vineyard House as well. It was beautiful. That was a super fun show. Had its own little quirks about it. That Barrel Room, super echoey. That's tricky. And so I had to drive home that night to take my girlfriend to the airport the next morning because she was going to Las Vegas with some friends to see Janet Jackson. So I drove home, slept for a few hours, took her to the airport, taught some music lessons, and then got right back in the car to drive to San Luis Obispo, where I was playing, you guessed it, a brewery, yes. And this was another one of these tiny little breweries. And I walked in, and it is a plywood stage that is 3 inches off the floor, and the place holds 23 people. And it was sold out. It was packed. All the nice thing is most of the shows this weekend were sold out. Whatever sold out meant for that show. And so I drove. It's a good 3.5 hour drive for me to get to San Luis Obispo. Went down there, did the show there for very little money, but I needed the stage time this weekend to get everything worked out. And then I immediately turned around, drove 3 hours back home. And then slept in a little bit Sunday morning. And then Sunday, I went and picked my girlfriend up from the airport. She got back from Vegas, and I brought her home. Immediately turned around, went to San Francisco to do the Cobb's Comedy Club. I was doing the San Francisco Summer Comedy Bash at Cobb's Comedy Club last night, which, again, big, huge room. Big, huge room, big stage, big sound, big light, all that kind of stuff. And we had a really nice crowd there. It was not sold out, but we were competing against the Outside Lands Music Festival that was happening at the same time. But a solid crowd in there, and that was fun. And, man, so just now it's I'm back in front of the laptop doing the work today. But it was just there's so many different kinds of venues that we play. It's just craziness, from little tiny postage stamp plywood stages to the big stage with the lights and the sound. It's been adventurous. But Comedy Palace this Friday. Actually, before I do the Comedy Palace, on Wednesday, August the 14th, I'm doing a headlining show here in my hometown in San Jose at the Art Boutique Music Hall, which is a great venue. It's where I filmed my last special, actually. And so one of the local producers here is producing a new show there. And so I'm going to go out and headline that. One last run through on the show, and then we go to San Diego to film on the 16th. And then, so other stuff coming up. If you're going to be in Fort Myers in October for the Pirate Festival in Fort Myers, I will be there that weekend performing at the Laugh In Comedy Club October 10th through 12th. So you can get your tickets for that. Do your pirating thing during the day. Come listen to some comedy at night. I'll be hanging around the Pirate Festival during the day too, so you probably see me around there. And I've got dates in Oregon coming up. Minnesota is coming up. Vancouver, Canada is coming up. All that's on the tour dates. Go to underthecrossbones.com. You can click on the tour dates button. That'll show you where I'm playing. Or just go to philjohnsоncomedy.com, and that'll all be there too. All right? So I got that all out of the way. But man, I'm excited for this show. It's going to be fantastic. We are sponsored today by Scuba Wise Treasure Expedition Sunken Treasure Workshop. This is the experience of a lifetime. It's fantastic. I definitely kind of want to do this myself, even though I'm terrified of water. But you're going to spend the day with world-renowned treasure hunters in the Florida Keys, learning how to find sunken treasure on the 1733 fleet of Spanish galleons. They're sitting there under the water, just waiting for you. And these guys are going to take you out. It's a family-friendly trip. You can scuba, you can snorkel, you can just come along for the boat ride, which I might do, but oh boy, I'd want to get in the water. And also, I'd want to not get in the water. You'll explore real sunken Spanish galleons. You're going to see cannons, all sorts of good stuff. And your hosts are amazing dudes. Captain Carl Fizmer, world-renowned treasure hunter. He's going to be there taking you in the water. You heard him back on episode 108 of this show. Captain Bradley Williamson, who you've seen on Expedition Unknown on the Travel Channel. He's going to be there taking you in the water, and you heard him back on episode 181 of this show. Dive Master Marc Littleton hasn't been on this show yet, but it's only a matter of time. But he'll be there. He's got 35 years of experience recovering artifacts from ships like the Andrea Doria and the Pinta. So these are dudes who know what they're doing. They do this for a living, and they're going to take you in the water down to these Spanish galleons and show you what's up. You're going to learn real skills. This is not a fluff trip, man. You're going to learn how to find good shipwrecks to salvage. You're going to learn about all the legalities of doing so, the technology that you need to have to do it. And if you want to get into it, they're going to show you how to find the money, how to find the funding to mount one of these shipwreck diving projects of your own. You're going to get pictures of your trip included free, a certificate of completion, new friends that'll last a lifetime. Go to underthecrossbones.com/scuba. That's underthecrossbones.com/scuba, and they will give you a free treasure map just for checking them out. So again, go to underthecrossbones.com/scuba and sign up for the Scuba Wise Sunken Treasure Workshop right now. Do it. If you want to support the show in other ways, you can do that too. Go to underthecrossbones.com/support. A little PayPal box there. Drop a donation in that PayPal box of whatever amount you feel is appropriate. You can also click the Amazon banner that's right there. You go over to Amazon, you buy yourself something nice, doesn't cost you anything extra. Amazon kicks me back a few shekels. That helps me keep the old boat afloat. And if you want to be a sponsor of the show, we can handle that too. All that information is there at underthecrossbones.com/support. All right, so let's get into this. So we're going to journey now to the mid-1800s, and we're going to talk about the last pirate of New York with Rich Cohen. Here we go. The Last Pirate of New York. I have both of the copies you sent me sitting here on my desk. Thank you for that. Fantastic book. I was the entire third act of the book, I was completely taken by surprise by. That is very shocking. So in a spoiler-free kind of way, can you give us sort of a synopsis of the book? Because I'm sure most of my listeners don't know this story.
Well, it's about a guy who described himself as the worst person who ever lived. Albert Hicks was sort of a pirate in the sense that he was like a gangster meets pirate. He was a mutineer. And I try to tell the story of the last 3 months of his life from when, like in classic movie gangster mode, he decides for one last big score to set up his retirement, and that's the one that goes wrong. And it winds up in what was one of the first great detective manhunts in New York City. Leads to a huge trial, which is like an O.J. Simpson-like trial of the century, and then New York City's last public execution, which was done in the morning, Friday the 13th, 1860, the summer before the Civil War, on Bedlos Island, which is where the Statue of Liberty now stands, and you couldn't make up a better symbol than that. And was done as 20,000 people watched.
That's amazing. Why do you think this story has, I don't want to say been lost to history, but is not more well-known previously?
Well, I think the big reason is because this was the summer before the Civil War. And I always feel like the Civil War was like a comet that was about to hit the country. And it sealed everything kind of in amber. And everything that happened before the Civil War was like antebellum. It was just a different period of time. And it just suddenly seemed ancient, even though, you know, it just seemed like from another era of the city. But that said, he did remain well known for a long time in that in the early 60s, the Twilight Zone did an episode about a guy who owns a wax museum, and the wax museum is being shut down, and the wax figures come to life and start killing people. And there's two wax figures, Jack the Ripper and Albert Hicks. Very accurately dressed Albert Hicks. So 1960, whatever, people were expected to know who Hicks was. And I found a story in the New Yorker that was a profile of the last hangman from the Tombs prison. And he said the highlight of his career was the hanging of the pirate Albert Hicks. I worked at the New Yorker as my first job, and I know those fact checkers. If they have any doubt you're going to know who somebody is, it will say, you know, you could write Joe Montana, they'll add comma, who is he? And you have to say quarterback of the San Francisco 49ers. So the fact that they didn't identify Hicks shows that he was well known for a long time. But I think in our own era, there's really no photographs of him. You know, There's just a drawing, like a very famous drawing done at the time for a magazine, and there's some sketches done here and there. So there's just not a lot of media on him. So he becomes, you know, you can't see a picture. It's like Napoleon.
Right. Right. That's interesting. And I suppose even, a Twilight Zone episode in the mid-'60s, that's 100 years on. So that's a pretty extensive legacy to begin with there. So that's pretty interesting.
And also it's worth saying that it wasn't out of nowhere that they had, because P.T. Barnum, who was, the famous sideshow freak guy, went in and traded Albert Hicks $25 cash and 2 boxes of 5-cent cigars, which were good cigars, to make a wax mask of his face. And he had a wax figure of him on display in Manhattan as the worst man who ever lived. So it made sense that it was a wax museum. I mean, somebody who wrote that episode knew that he'd been this wax figure in the city at a museum seen by millions of people.
Right. And so P.T. Barnum entered the picture, and I was like, this is too over the top. This is just such a crazy story that I was surprised I didn't know it before. I have plenty of family in New York and New Jersey, and we're an Italian family, and so we got a lot of the mob stories, but somehow missed a lot of that kind of stuff. How did you run across the story?
Well, so my father's from Brooklyn, and I grew up in the Midwest, and he used to tell me stories about mobsters from his neighborhood where he grew up. And that was the Jewish mob, which was Murder Incorporated. Those were guys who also were forgotten because they died in the electric chair during the Second World War. And basically he told me those stories about those guys instead of regular bedtime stories. And when I came to New York, I became completely fascinated about learning the real history of, like, was my father telling me true? Was it made up? And along the way of doing all this research, I came across the story of Albert W. Hicks, who was described as kind of a forerunner to the modern mobster. He's written about in the famous, great Herbert Asbury book, Gangs in New York, which writes about river pirates and the old gangs in the 5 Points, and also written about by Luc Sante in his book, Lowlife. And in those stories, Hicks just sort of jumped off the page as this guy. The way they depicted him was in a city full of gangs, he was the one guy that didn't belong to any gang because people joined gangs for protection. Albert Hicks was a guy you needed to be protected from. And that one night he was drinking alone at a bar on Cherry Street, which is right near the water, and somebody slipped a Mickey in his drink, kidnapped him, put him on this ship, and the deal is they would kidnap you, put you on these ships, and when you woke up, days later you were told work or swim. And in the worst case, you woke up on a ship bound for China, meaning you'd be gone for a year, and that was where the term Shanghai came from.
Yep.
And that Hicks became enraged, and actually Asbury even has a quote from him, and he just killed everybody on the ship. So to me, it's like the greatest kind of genre, which is it's like a bad guy accidentally picks on someone who's even worse than him, But when I just became fascinated by it. But when I went back and started really looking at the police files and the court case, I realized that wasn't true at all. That Hicks was a pure predator, and he picked this ship out. No one shanghaied him. He picked the ship out because he thought it was an easy score. It would be a ship carrying a lot of cash, and he could handle everybody on that ship by himself.
Right. In kind of the background of the story, there is this idea of river pirates and the New York gangs, the 5 Points gangs, and some of the other ones are actually taking down ships on the river. Can you give us a little bit of background on that? Because it's not really a thing we think about all that much.
Well, so we think of pirates, or I do, as like one era, and then gangsters as another era, when in fact, pirate crews are very much like gangs. They operated in the same way. And if you go back, I wrote a big, long story that was in the Paris Review about John Lafitte, famous American pirate, John Lafitte, if you read about him, he was really like a gangster working as a fence. He was just working on ships. And in New York, just like in Goodfellas, remember Goodfellas, they're robbing trucks. The river pirates work like that, but they didn't have trucks. They were carrying all the commerce in ships. And these were often gangs of kids in the slums, and they were in the sewers right beneath the water line, and they would come out in these flat-bottom boats. They called them the Daybreak Boys because they came out just before daybreak, and they would take over and rob these ships and sometimes kill people in the process, never what they were trying to do. And they would go as far north, as into Westchester County, New York, on these ships, attack farms, attack people, attack boats. And there were various gangs of river pirates. The Swamp Angels was another one, and it was a serious problem for the city to the point where they started something called the Harbor Patrol, which would be like the Coast Guard, but just for the city, just to fight the river pirates. They had big battles, and then pirates, of course, had a long history in New York. And my book takes place the summer of 1860. At that time, the federal government did a study and said there were up to 500 pirates living in Manhattan in 1860.
Wow, that's crazy. That sounds like a whole other book in itself right there.
Yeah. It's not the Pirates of the Caribbean. It's the Pirates of New York Bay, you know?
Yeah, certainly. And is there, because you've written about a whole bunch of things in your career, some of them I want to get into a little bit later. Is there something that keeps you from immediately jumping into a book like that when you find something else interesting like that, where you go, that's a whole other story? Does it cross through your brain to do that next book, or is there something that keeps you from doing it?
I mean, it's just like very cool and interesting, and you feel like you can kind of recreate a world that's been lost a little bit. And to me, it's all these people that it's almost like, I'll tell you something that fascinated me, which was Arnold Rothstein was a famous gangster depicted in a lot of movies, often depicted wrongly. But he's the guy who sort of organized crime in America in a way. But one thing he did was he was the first guy that we know of who took all his money and put it in a roll and held it in his front pocket. And when people asked for money, he would take out the roll and snap them off. And that's why they called him the big bankroll. And I always think every time you see somebody like a guy at a parking lot and you want change and he pulls a roll out of his pocket and starts snapping them off, he's copying somebody who's copying somebody who's copying somebody who's copying Arnold Rothstein, though he doesn't know it. And that's how, that's culture. And to me, it's just like, I'm just, as a person, I just always want to know how things started. One thing about Albert Hicks that interested me was how important he was in the culture of other gangsters, knew his story and told his story. And they're the ones who changed the story to say he'd been a victim before he'd been a predator, which was untrue because what he did was so bad that he couldn't really be a hero. But when you go back and look at Hicks, for example, I wrote this sort of story in the New York Times arguing that he invented the whole gangster style because so much was about how he dressed, how he looked, you know, his coat. That's why Barnum traded for his clothes, because it was very distinct. He was like a dandy. You know, he's a great-looking guy in pictures. So I think that's a big part of all this stuff, which is where does our world come from? Who were the first people? And, you know, how did we get here?
Yeah, it's such a shame that P.T. Barnum Museum burned down at one point. Otherwise, we might still have that wax figure.
But if you,
which would be a game changer.
Yeah, no, I was looking back at it. It's interesting. It's like you look at all the elements of New York as it existed at the time I wrote about it, and one of the main things that still exists basically unchanged is the P.T. Barnum part of it. You know, if you go to Times Square, it's still P.T. Barnum.
Sure.
He invented that. The Ripley's Museum, all this stuff, even a ride like Pirates of the Caribbean at Disney World, which probably, I'm saying there's all these different reasons why I'm interested in what I'm interested in. Probably the whole reason I've written every book I've written is because at age 6, I went on that ride when I was a kid and was completely blown away by it. But his museum was that ride just in an earlier version. You know what I mean?
Sure, yeah.
He didn't want to celebrate the great people of the world. He wanted to celebrate the notorious people in the world.
Sure.
Celebrate's maybe the wrong word, but tell their story.
Yeah, exactly. That's interesting. The Pirates of the Caribbean ride is certainly my origin story on a lot of this stuff too, and it's a common one that comes up on this show. We used to ride it when I was a kid, looking for home decorating ideas. Yeah,
I just wanted to go in there and you know, just check out, get off the ride and walk around in some of those towns because it looks, you know.
Yeah.
It's just seems more interesting than anything actually happening out in the world when you're a kid.
Yeah, certainly. So how does that theme tie into some of the other books that you've written? Like, I know you wrote Tough Jews, which is about the Jewish gangsters and things like that, but you have a book about working with the Rolling Stones and a whole bunch of other stuff. I'm looking at your list of books here, and there's so many I need to read. How do you go about choosing the story that you actually want to tackle and get into? Well,
one thing I've always believed is if you could tell me when you're 15, when I was 15, you could tell me someday you're going to write a book about the New York's last pirate who's publicly hanged. If a 15-year-old would say, that sounds cool, then I'll do it. You know?
Right.
So basically, another book of mine was about, I grew up in Chicago, was the 1985 Chicago Bears, who were, in their own way, they were like our pirates. It's all these kind of guys that live outside, you know, the law. And my favorite athlete growing up was Jim McMahon, who was like, you know, a complete nut job who said things no professional person had ever said that had ever heard. So there is, you know, it's kind of the stories that you grow up with and makes you are who you are. So there is something about all these people who live outside the law and they have to create their own morality. And one thing I was always interested in pirates about is if you actually, now getting into the more traditional pirates, if you read how those ships were organized, they were more fair and more democratic than anything going on the Navy ships.
Yeah.
So because they lived outside the law, they had to actually have a law. And I think it is that great Bob Dylan line, to live outside the law, you must be honest. And that's what I see in all these people. It's not like honor among thieves. It's like, if there is no system, we have to create our own system. And that was true with just about everything I've written. The Rolling Stones, of course, just love music. I love the Rolling Stones, and Keith Richards is a kind of model for all the modern pirates. So I guess there's a theme there.
I suppose so. Yep. And so part of the reason you wrote about the Stones was because I guess you traveled with them as a reporter for Rolling Stone. I can't even imagine writing for Rolling Stone and being on the road with the Rolling Stones. It's redundant and amazing.
Yeah.
What was that experience like?
I was really young. I was writing little magazine stories. I was out of college not very long, and I wrote these weird little stories for Rolling Stone that were oddball stories. I wrote about mountain bikers. I wrote about secondhand clothing stores. And then one day I got called in by Jan Wenner, who owned the magazine. He sort of said, "What are you doing this summer?" No one asked me what I'm doing this summer in my life. He was like, "What are you doing tonight?" I'm like, "I guess I'm doing nothing this summer." He said, "How'd you like to go watch the Rolling Stones rehearse and prepare for their next tour?" And I was on a plane that night. One of the reasons I got a lot of these good assignments was I would just be the one who would go right now. I don't even have to go home. And it was incredible because I flew out there right then. They were in Toronto, Canada, and they took us in a car service to an elementary school in the middle of the summer, in the middle of nowhere. And it's like every other elementary school, like the one I went to, and you walk through the doors and you just hear the riff for Brown Sugar. And you follow that riff down, and there's Keith Richards and the band just playing in an empty gym. And I just sat there for 7 hours from midnight until 7 a.m. and watched them play all their songs, and then went out on the road with them. So what was it like? It was like a life-defining experience, and it was a little bit like going to the Natural History Museum and falling into the diorama and ending up with the grizzly bears.
Okay, I like that analogy.
Yeah.
That's funny. That is bizarre that they were practicing at an elementary school, though. I can't imagine that, in that area, there's not a decent rehearsal studio that can accommodate.
Well, they didn't want anybody to know that they were around. And think about it. You think about the most boring place in the world. Think about your elementary school in July. Nothing. You assume nothing is going on there. You don't think maybe the Rolling Stones are rehearsing there.
Yeah.
And then the first indication that they're around is just before the tour starts, and then I went home, I wrote the story, came back for this. They just go into a bar that sometimes has bands, a bar that holds 200 people, and play a set. And that was amazing for me, too, because I'm sitting there watching them play, and I'm thinking, oh my God, this is how the Rolling Stones are supposed to be. Now you see why they're the greatest band in the world, because in a little bar, even though now they seem incredibly old to me, they're 50 years old, right? In a little bar, they are the greatest, and I'm a big fan of bar bands. I went to school in New Orleans. This is the greatest bar band I have ever heard.
Okay.
And then you put them in an arena, and they're a great arena band, but it's not the same thing.
Certainly. And I honestly, I think that's true of almost any good band. I would much rather see them in a 200-seater. Butch Walker is one of my favorite artists of all time. And Butch he is a master of the form of rock music in general. And but he plays like a 200, 300-seater. And it's just always amazing to see that guy. And I can't even imagine what it's like to see the Stones in that.
I asked Mick Jagger, I said, why don't you do a tour where you just forget 200 seats, because I know that's crazy. Why don't you play at the Beacon in New York, which is, I don't know what that is. It's like 5,000 people instead of 70,000 people,
Yeah.
And he said, there's just too much demand. People get angry and blah, 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 blah. We can't do it. But Elvis Costello's done it. I've seen people do it where they play 30 nights in one place. That's sort of what Springsteen did on Broadway, I guess, but without a band.
Certainly, yeah. And that was an amazing show, too. Actually, the Stones did do that, and I want to say they did it at the Beacon. They put out a DVD. Right. Scorsese directed it. Yeah. That's
right. But because when you put it on a movie, and I'm sure Scorsese said, I can't do it in an arena, But, right. I like to think that was, I planted a seed somehow, came back into his head.
Yeah. Yes, take credit where credit is due.
Yeah.
There were two other books in your list here that I found really intriguing. One was, and this one makes sense against the Stone Stories, the Chess Records book, which is a fascinating story all its own. I imagine you actually visited Chess Records, the studio itself in Chicago.
I grew up in a town outside of Chicago, actually called Glencoe, and Leonard Chess started Chess Records, lived down at the street. I didn't know who he was when he was a kid. When I got into that music, which was in high school, and I realized Leonard Chess was dead by then, but he lived right there. And the fact that, and Leonard Chess's brother, Phil Chess, who died just a few years ago, lived in the next town. And their son, Marshall Chess, who wound up working for the Rolling Stones and running Chess Records for a while, like was a short order cook at the deli in our town for a while. It just made it all like it was ours, you know. And also, if you're a kid in Chicago, Buddy Guy, who was on Chess Records, owned the Checkerboard Lounge and on the South Side. And we all went there because basically, I'd like to say it was because we were great music aficionados. We went there because they would serve you alcohol when you were 15 years old, you know. So that's where everybody went, you know, and you got introduced to this incredible music because you went for the red wine, basically.
Yeah, right. That's funny. I was in one of my favorite things to do when I'm traveling for shows is I will go visit recording studios that I can, you know, the place like, and I went and visited Chess Records, and I had tried a couple of times and they weren't open for some reason. And so I was like, oh, they're open today. I'm going to go. And the door was locked and I knocked on the door and this little old guy comes out and he goes, "Hi, what's up?" I said, "Are you guys open today doing tours?" And he goes, "Oh, well, the lady's not here that does them, but I'll turn the lights on and you can wander around if you want." Yeah. And I was like, all right, well, I guess I know enough of the stories to give myself a tour. And I was like, oh, here's the hallway where Muddy Waters was changing a light bulb when Keith Richards showed up, and
right.
You know, and just like all that kind of stuff. And I was like, I wish they would do more with those studios because there's so much history there.
I think that they've lately the city has tried to get involved and make it more of like a regular museum because I know what you're talking about. And the legacy of chess is weird. And Willie Dixon, I think, came to own it. And Willie Dixon sort of got very angry at them at the end of his life. So I think that had a lot to do with it. But to me, my favorite thing is, I don't know if you ever heard the story about when the Rolling Stones toured and they became friends with Marshall Chess and they wanted to record a Chess and all those guys came to see him. So like Willie Dixon, Muddy Waters, whoever else was still alive. Little Walter, maybe he wasn't alive anymore. They were all there watching, and Jagger sang that first song with his back to the room because he couldn't look at them as he sang their songs, basically.
Oh, my gosh. Yeah, I can see that. That's intimidating company to be in. Yeah.
But they loved him, actually.
Amazing.
That's the thing people don't realize. People talk about they love the Rolling Stones because the Rolling Stones didn't just cover their music. They added a new element,
right,
which they were interested in. I think they recognized that they were a great blues band, you know?
Yeah.
And it's like when Howlin' Wolf went and toured England, he toured with the Eric Clapton band, I think. I mean, they knew that the best blues musicians in the world by the time you got into the later 70s were these guys from England because they're the ones who loved the music the most as American music kind of moved into a different phase.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that kind of stuff is what really kept them out of the appropriation argument because they were not only playing those songs, but also taking those guys out and exposing them to a new audience, which completely revitalized it.
Yeah. I mean, it's not like Pat Boone they were adding something to it and they were
right.
And they also gave him a whole second career. I mean, we don't know what would have happened to Chuck Berry's career if the Rolling Stones didn't come around, but it's easy to imagine it would have been more like someone like Lloyd Price who kind of disappeared a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. Which would have been a terrible thing to happen.
Yeah.
That's very cool. I'm a huge blues guy and that I spent just years and years playing nothing but the blues on guitar. So yeah, I love all that stuff. The Sweet and Low story is very intriguing. I have to read this book because it's one of those like little tiny hidden stories where you go, really? That seems impossible.
Right.
Tell me about that book.
Well, it's my family, which is my grandfather was he was a lawyer, went to St. John's Law School, couldn't get a job in the law during the Depression, and he got married to my grandmother, and my grandmother's family owned a diner in Brooklyn. My grandfather took over the diner, and it was across the street from the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and when World War II started, it was just jam-packed all the time because it was a place everybody ate when they left the basically base. And after World War II, his business just ended in a day, and, because the draft ended and everything. So
right.
He didn't know what to do, so when he was a little kid, he worked in a factory where he bagged tea. Okay. So he knew how to do that. So he bought a bunch of tea bagging machines, and he converted his diner into a tea bags factory, and he called it had been the Cumberland Diner because it's on Cumberland Street in Brooklyn. He renamed it the Cumberland Packing Company. If you look on the back of Sweet and Low packet, it still says that, Cumberland Packing Company. And he bagged all this tea, and he couldn't sell it. There was like plenty of tea in the world. There was no market for tea. And he'd spent all his money on these machines, and he was like, had his family, he was in big trouble, and he didn't know what to do. And he went with my grandmother to this diner called Cookies in Brooklyn, and he said, what are we going to do? And she said, why don't you package sugar? And the reason is because they worked in the diner together, and he always complained that the sugar bowl was not sanitary because everyone stuck their spoons in it, stuck it in their mouth, stuck it back in the thing, and that the sugar dispensers get all clogged up and were gross. So he took his tea bagging machines and converted them into sugar packing machines, and he invented the sugar packet. And then he took his idea to Domino Sugar, and obviously they asked him two questions. First question is, how does it work? And second question is, did you get a patent on this? And he didn't. And they just started packaging their own sugar, but he set up this packing company where he packed sugar for other companies and then packed other things. He also invented the soy sauce packet. And and then he always wanted something to put in his own packages, and he was always on a diet, and they had these cyclamate pills, which you just sort of drop, but he wanted something you could actually put in your iced tea and see like rain down. And he got together with a chemist, and they invented all these different formulas of fake sugar, and they came up with the one that was best. My Aunt Barbara designed the packet, and they started selling it to hospitals for diabetics. They called it Sweet and Low after a poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson. And then they found out that people were stealing it from hospitals. And then people started showing up trying to buy it in bulk, and it became this gigantic thing. And my story is a whole long story. The mafia gets involved in this too. The mafia kind of took over the factory at a certain point. And my mother was disinherited after my grandfather died by my grandmother. And that's my advantage on the story. And so just to give you my sense of the story is that my father was dating my mother when my grandfather was inventing Sweet and Low, and he'd show up for a date, and there'd be like 15 different little cups of coffee, each sweetened with a different formula, and my dad had to try them all. And when it came out later that they said the saccharin, key ingredient, causes cancer, my father's first reaction was, I knew it. I knew that bastard was trying to kill me. Yeah.
That's amazing. I mean, I like to think about things like that and go, okay, yeah, somebody invented the idea of doing this, but then you never realize that there's going to be some weird, mafia-fueled dark backside story that goes on behind those things either.
Right. Well, not only that, it's like once you do it, you sort of think that your story is utterly unique. Okay? Like, who has a story like Sweet and Low in their family? Then you write this book and you go around and you realize everybody does. I mean, there's in every family, and then you start looking at everything different. So you see like a ketchup, I don't know the story, but you see like a Heinz bottle on the diner table. You're like, I bet there's a giant family fight going on over that. You see a running shoe. I bet there's a giant family fight going on over that. It's just a typical, there's a huge amount of money. There's humans involved. There's an invention that everybody takes credit for. There's going to be a fight. So then you realize that our entire world consists of atoms and quarks and protons and neutrons, and you can see it all if you have the right kind of eyes. It just consists of fights everywhere. Everywhere's a fight, which brings you back to the pirates.
Yeah, certainly, right. I guess ours was pretty mellow. We always the family lore is that my grandfather invented printing on T-shirts. Like he would make his own printed T-shirts and wear them out, and it was before anybody was printing anything on T-shirts.
Yeah.
And everybody would go, that's a thing. You should do that. And he'd be like, nah, nobody would want these. That was my family. Nah, nobody would want that.
Right.
We don't need to do that.
But that's what always, I remember my first job, I was a messenger at the New Yorker. And there's a writer there named Mark Singer, who's a great writer. And somebody was complaining about somebody's idea. And he said, ideas are a dime a dozen. The execution is the entire thing. And
yeah, exactly.
It's like I have a million great ideas that I just don't, I wouldn't even, it's like so overwhelming. Like, how do you do it?
Yeah.
So the thing about my grandfather that was amazing is he did it. And then his family's been living off of it for generations. But he actually converted, my grandma said it, but then he actually converted the machine to pack tea. And then he actually invented the Sweet and Low. Most people just have a lot of ideas, but it's the execution that's the hard part.
Right. And I think a big part of that is it wasn't like he was a plumber and then thought, I'm going to go package sugar. He had the experience bagging the teas, and then he moved to sugar, and then he thought we need a substitute for the sugar. There was that progression.
And he had
the double.
He had both experiences, which is he was annoyed. I mean, it's just a classic invention. Like, I'm going to fix something that's annoying me personally. Right. Which was I'm annoyed at cleaning out the sugar bottles every day. Yeah. And also, I am on a diet because I want to look different, and I have no way to put this. And it just usually, if you feel something strongly, the way it works is millions and millions of other people feel it too. They're just not saying it. So
yeah, certainly.
Yeah,
and I think that's usually why a lot of the best or at least the success stories that come out of that. When you listen to successful people talk about projects like that, it's always like, well, I had this thing and this thing and this thing that all built the foundation that when that good idea finally came up, I was able to execute on it.
Right. And you realize that your need is just a universal need. I mean, writing is based on the same thing, which is if it's true for me, it's going to be true for a lot of other people too. And
when you say that, are you talking about if I find this story interesting, I think other people will as well?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, if I keep coming back to this story, and it wasn't just so Albert Hicks being an example, I was thinking about that story for 20 years, and it was just this idea of this ship, because the way it happened is he went on the ship and he killed all these people, but that really wasn't the way the story began for the people in New York. The way it began was they woke up one day and there was just what they called the ghost ship, just this abandoned ship with the sails down, all busted up, just floating around New York Harbor, and it just scared the crap out of people. And when they went aboard, the ship was completely empty. It's like a Twilight Zone, but there was blood everywhere. They towed the ship in and they found 4 fingers and a thumb. That was the only evidence, and that image of that ship, because it's like, again, it's like a symbol. It's like, you want to talk about society like out of control and no law and no order, just an abandoned ship with no people on it. And I just think if that image moves me, it has to move. It's worth exploring because I'm mostly just like everybody else. That's how I feel.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, an image like that's straight out of, an Agatha Christie format for here's a good murder mystery. We got a ghost ship and 4 fingers and a thumb. Go.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
I thought the structure of the book was interesting in that you basically tell the story backwards. Was that your reason for doing that? Was because you were trying to capture how the public was learning about it at the time?
Yeah. And also I thought it was cool to have this guy seem like a character that you kind of know about. Okay. Like you accept him as a character and realize later when he gives a confession, you get the whole details of his life that you didn't know anything about, and you look at him a completely different way. And weirdly, I was reading Crime and Punishment when I wrote it, and I noticed that Dostoevsky keeps doing that, which is he'll introduce what seems like a marginal minor character that you don't think much about. And then 300 pages into the book, suddenly he gives you his backstory, whereas we always do everything. You want the backstory. You can't wait for it. You know what I mean?
Right.
So the way you have to do it is you have to give enough information early on that the people don't notice something's missing. And then, of course, it had the advantage of that's how the people in New York learned about him.
Yeah.
Which is, he was a complete mystery. At first, they had a fake name. Then they learned a few details. Then they learned a few more. And then he gave his confession, which was a complete dazzlement and shock to everybody. And I wanted the reader to be able to experience it in the same way.
Yeah, I found that to be really interesting because I got into it and I was like, oh, we're already at the crime. Oh, okay. Well, they already got him. Where's this going to go now? And then the whole 3rd act of the book, I was like, oh my God, this is insane.
Right.
About all that stuff that happened. That's crazy. Yeah. I mean, so definitely a fascinating story.
And that was the idea. And so much stuff in writing, like people are so anxious that they don't have the audience with them, that they want to use all the good stuff right at the beginning because they're only going to get a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
So you have to sort of have confidence that people will stay with this book. It will be interesting enough to get to this big payoff, which will come later. And that is how it happened. But, there is like a pressure to sort of get everything interesting in the first 2 minutes. And then the book has no shape to it if you do that. That's what I found.
Yeah, certainly. And I guess because I write as well, that I was, as I got halfway through it, and I was like, he's already in jail. They've already sentenced him and all this kind of, and I was like, this is going to get better because there's still the entire second half of the book here. So I know there's going to be way more story to this. And it made me curious to keep reading because I go, it was like a cliffhanger almost because I was not really a cliffhanger plot wise, but cliffhanger from a writer's standpoint where I was like, what's he going to do with this now?
Yeah. Well, because I'm a big believer, there's a famous Hemingway quote where he said, writing it's architecture, not interior decoration.
Yeah.
And I do feel that the structure is everything.
Yeah.
And it's like the hull of a ship.
Right.
And you build the ship around it. So that was something that was exciting for me too, writing it, because I wrote it for an order, and I knew that I had the big, most important part of the story was going to come at the end. That you were going to try to, if it worked, experience this guy as the same sort of mystery a person living in Manhattan in 1860 would have experienced him too, and found out his real story only on the eve of his death.
Yeah. Yeah, and fascinating. And the I thought the whole idea that the piracy charge was almost a technicality that took him down. I thought that was interesting too, much in the way where they would take down Capone with taxes, and things like that.
Exactly. I mean, basically the deal was no bodies, no murder.
Mm-hmm.
And he some people think he popularized the phrase. So I did a lot of searching on it. It existed before, but he was the first one to say, like, very loudly and in the press, "Dead men tell no tales." And he had killed something like over 100 people. Anybody that was a witness, he'd kill him.
Right.
So basically, there were no bodies, but they had such strong circumstantial evidence. But they knew if they charged him with the most they could charge him with was robbery.
Right.
Because found all the stolen stuff on him, but he would have gotten like 10 years in jail, and he committed this triple murder. So they charged him with piracy, which is why he's one of the last pirates, because piracy, if you were convicted of piracy, was capital punishment.
Right.
And the reason why it's interesting is because anyone who commits a crime in the high seas, but his defense lawyer said, but he wasn't on the high seas. He was in New York Harbor. And they presented to the judge really good, coherent argument. I read the whole thing. And the judge basically says, yeah, I agree with you. You're right, but I don't care. We're going to charge him with piracy anyway. And that's the human element.
Right.
That the law never, which is the judge believed he did it and didn't really care.
Yep.
He thought the guy should die.
Yeah, fascinating. So I know you have to go hop on a flight here pretty soon, so we'll kind of tie it up here. What are you working on now? I know you're out doing book tours and all sorts of stuff for this one, but what's your next project going to look like?
Well, check it out. If you get Harper's Magazine, I have a big story coming out at the end of August about the NFL Combine.
Okay.
And the whole way of judging athletes based on numbers and statistics, which is, I have kids and I just watch them go through the tryouts, and the way that they pick kids for different teams fascinates me because it's all based on these numbers.
Right.
And this is, again, like when you know that if you watch people play, the most important stuff cannot be measured. But since there's no way to measure it, it's like it's invisible.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so with like kids, it's very simple. Like you can pick the kids for hockey, say, that are the best skaters, but you can't know if you have a 5-game tournament who's still going to be playing after 4 games.
Yeah.
I mean, who's going to quit and who's going to keep playing.
Right.
And this goes back to my Bears book, which George Halas had this great line, who started the Bears, started the NFL, which is he used to say the quality was the old zipperoo.
Okay.
And Doug Plank, who was my favorite guy ever on the Bears, who was the 46th defense and was an incredibly hard hitter, had this thing where he said, we've all seen these guys, you look at them, they're incredible, they look great, they run fast, you put them in pads, they don't want to hit anybody. They just don't want to hit anybody.
Right.
And then you have these little guys you look at, you think, not in a million years, you put them in pads, and they're just an animal.
Yeah.
They're just the best football player I've ever seen. And that is the old zipperoo.
Okay. Yeah.
That's what the story's about.
Okay. Interesting. That sounds like it'll be cool. So where's the best place online for people to keep up with what you're doing?
I don't know. I have a website, authorrichcohen.com.
Okay.
And I have a Twitter, which is at RichCohen2003, which I'm very responsive to.
Okay.
And, all my books are on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and all that stuff.
Great. Fantastic. Well, I will link it all up in the show notes so we can turn some people on to some new stuff because it's just a fascinating collection of books, and I'm going to go read a whole bunch more of them now myself.
Thanks. Well, I'm a fan of your show, which is what's really great to be on here.
Thank you. I appreciate that a lot. Fly safe, and we'll talk soon, man.
All right. Take it easy. Thank you.
You bet. Bye-bye. And there it is, friends. That is my talk with Rich Cohen about his book, The Last Pirate of New York. How fascinating was that? Seriously, that was such an amazing talk. That guy has written about so many interesting things. The whole Sweet and Low deal, crazy. And now I want to find out which famous bands were rehearsing in my elementary school cafeteria when I was a kid. I guarantee it wasn't the Rolling Stones. It's San Jose. Might have been the Doobie Brothers. I think that might have been our only possibility playing in the school cafeteria. But that was so fun. I really enjoyed that talk, and I hope you did too. Again, we are giving away 2 copies of The Last Pirate of New York. You have through the end of August to register to win those. Just send an email to phil@underthecrossbones.com and put in the subject line, I want a book. And then in the body, just put like your name and your email address so I know where to contact you at, all that kind of good stuff. If you want to find out more about Rich Cohen and what he's up to, go to authorrichcohen.com. And of course, all the show notes for this episode will be at underthecrossbones.com/203. We're sponsored today by Pirate Radio The Treasure Coast, WKKC-DB, playing the best music of today's hits and yesterday's classics, and you can hear Under the Crossbones on there every Wednesday at 10 p.m. To go listen, go to pirateradiooftheTreasureCoast.com. You can also use the Live 365 app and search for Pirate Radio, or dial up your Google, your Alexa, go, hey Alexa, hey Google, and ask it to play Pirate. Nope, stop Google, not now. You can... My phone sitting here next to me. You can say, hey Google, play Pirate Radio The Treasure Coast, and it'll do that for you. Although don't whisper at it. I whispered so that my own phone wouldn't turn on again.
I really like when you ask the questions.
Did you hear that? Oh, that's great. She really likes when I ask the questions. Oh my. They're listening at all times. You know that, right? They're all listening to us. So to find out more, go to pirateradiooftheTreasureCoast.com. You can tune in and listen right there. They've been a great sponsor of the show all this time, and I like that. I thank them for that. And that is our show for today, friends. Thank you once again for tuning in. Be sure you go over to authorrichcohen.com to find out more about Rich Cohen and all the fascinating books that he's got. I'm making a list. I'm gonna go read a whole bunch of those now. Make sure that you send that email if you want to win a copy of The Last Pirate of New York, or even better, just go buy one. Just go buy one. It's not that expensive. But if you want to win a copy, send an email to phil@roadsideattract. Oh, wrong email address. Send an email to phil@underthecrossbones.com, and with the subject line, I want a book, and then put your contact information in the body of that email there. You have until August 31st to do that, and then we'll announce the winner through email and on the show. We're coming down to it. We are coming down to it. All the show notes for this episode are at underthecrossbones.com/203. Next week, episode number 204, which is going to be my last episode as host of this show. And so we'll talk more about that then. Nick Hoffman's going to be taking it over, starting from episode 205, working with that. He's going to do a great job. My guest on next week's show is going to be Lou Hernandez, a.k.a. Cutthroat Cortez of Pirates Plunder. And I think he is the perfect guest to be my last guest for the show because he is really part of the pirate community. He is out there doing amazing charitable works with his pirate character, and he's doing just a bunch of great things. So that is coming up next week. We are going to talk with Cutthroat Cortez. I think you're really going to enjoy that. And then after that, Nick Hoffman will be taking over the show. And I'll still be hanging in, popping in and out and doing things. But I have shows to write. I have books to write, things to release. And that's what I'll be doing. And some of those are pirate themed. So it's not the last you'll hear of me. And I can already tell the podcast bug is not out of my brain yet, because I was listening to a lot of podcasts while I was driving over the weekend, back and forth to gigs and things. And I'm listening like, I want to do some more of that. So there will be more podcasting in my future, but it needs a break for right now. So anyway, that's coming up. And I will see you next week on episode 204. Go visit authorrichcohen.com. Send me an email, phil@underthecrossbones.com, if you want to win a copy of The Last Pirate of New York. And I'll see you next week.